Perfect, you're recording now. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's live event titled Data Collection and Analysis. This is hosted by Evaluation Capacity Network located in Edmonton, Alberta. My name is Sherry Rezvani, and I'm a researcher at the Center for Community-Based Research. I will be the moderator for today's session. This live event is an hour long. For the first half, our presenters will provide an overview of data collection and analysis. The second half is allocated to answering your questions, so please feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat box during or after the presentation. I will share your questions with the presenters in the last 20 to 30 minutes of this live event. I'm pleased today to introduce our presenters, Rebecca, Jason, and Roxanne.
Thank you, Sherry. So we're having a few technical issues, and Roxanne is going to join us later, but my colleague Jason is here with me. I'm Rebecca Gokert, and I'm a professor at the University of Alberta. I'm here in Edmonton on a bit of a cloudy, rainy day. And I'm also the lead of the Evaluation Capacity Network, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a minute. Jason?
Thanks, Rebecca. My name is Jason Daniels, and I'm a researcher at the University of Alberta as well. I work with Rebecca in the Evaluation Capacity Network, and I've been working as an evaluator for about 15 years now.
Great. And our colleague Roxanne Felix Mosh will join us in a few minutes, and she is the co-executive director of the Multicultural Family Resource Society, and she's also a community-based researcher and evaluator and has many years of experience. Let's make sure we're advancing here. Oh, Jason, you might have to advance my slide. It doesn't seem to be. Oh, there we go. Okay, so as Jason and I mentioned, we're connected to the Evaluation Capacity Network, and this is a partnership that's based out of the University of Alberta. And it essentially formed to build evaluation capacity in the early childhood field. So there was a fair bit of interest in building capacity in that particular field. But because children are embedded in families, which are embedded in communities, and we support children and families through programs across our provinces and country, much of our focus has started to get into the social sector more broadly. And if you're interested in learning more, you can go to our website, evaluationcapacitynetwork.com, and we've got a number of resources there, learning opportunities, and access to expertise across Canada. Sorry, that's taking a little bit to advance the slides. So I'm just going to introduce Roxanne's organization, the Multicultural Family Resource Society, which is also based here in Edmonton. And at MFRS, they seek to ensure immigrant and refugee families are empowered and strengthened by knowledge, skills, and connections to achieve ultimate health and overall well-being. They believe social inclusion is at the heart of healthy communities. MFRS uses insight from their programming to inform their social enterprise, consulting, and advisory services in the areas of community-based research, consultations, nonprofit organizational development, evaluation, which is what we're here to talk about today, and participatory training in interculturalism and anti-racism. They believe that this work, in addition to their direct programming, can transform realities for newcomers.
Rebecca, sorry, just before you proceed, we have some technical issues. Some people can hear you and some can only hear Jason.
Oh. Okay. Emil cannot hear. Can somebody else get on? Kathy can't hear Jason. Sarah can hear both of us.
Rich is hearing both. Great.
Okay.
So,
I think we'll just have to keep going, and unfortunately, we are recording, so we'll be placing that on the website that I'm about to introduce to you. So if you're interested in checking out the live event after and kind of the question and answer period, then I encourage you to do that. I'm not sure why I'm not advancing here.
Oh, that's great.
Can you do that for me? Thank you. So this webinar is connected to a national project that my group, the Evaluation Capacity Network, is co-leading with our partners at the Center for Community-Based Research, and they're based out of Waterloo, and I think one of our colleagues is on the call today, Rich Jansen. The project is focused on building capacity of groups that support refugee newcomers to do community-based evaluation. It's funded by IRCC under the Service Delivery Improvement Program. And last year, we went on a bit of a roadshow across the country, and we did a number of practical how-to workshops. They were attended by over 300 people. Maybe you were there, because I know we've reached out to many past participants for these live events. And if not, you can check out the 5 webinars that we've created on the website that's based on the workshop material. And of course, workshop participants, they found those workshops helpful, but they really wanted to go a little deeper on a number of projects. And so in response, we've designed a series of live events to do just that. And today's webinar is the second in a series of events. And you can see past events as well as future events on the website under Learn More. So I encourage you to go check that out. Jason, next slide. Thank you. So speaking of our website, you can find a number of free resources there. So we have some brief videos, we have an evaluation readiness assessment, we have support for community-based ethics, and that's based out of Waterloo and the Center for Community-Based Research. We have a series of webinars, the workshops are up there, as well as the live events that we're just getting launched now. We're into our second event. You'll also find an outcome inventory that we've been compiling for the last few years based out of the literature as well as reports that we have access to. And you'll also find a list of mentors and coaches from across Canada that you can connect with for support for evaluation. And finally, and many of you may have connected to this live event through the Community of Practice, which is hosted by settlenet.org. Okay, so let's get into the reason that you've joined the live event today. So over the course of today, we're going to be focusing on the basics of data collection and analysis in a community-based evaluation context, some of the key considerations when preparing to undertake analysis of data, and then identifying some of the ethical considerations when collecting and analyzing data in a community context. And we'll invite our colleague Roxanne to speak to some of that. So with our time together, as Sherry mentioned, we're going to present for about roughly 25 to 30 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion because we'd really like to hear your thoughts. We'd like to hear some of the unique things that you're doing alongside the communities that you work with. Sherry's going to be monitoring the chat. So if questions arise as we're presenting, please feel free to type them in the chat box and then we can get to them after we're finished here. Okay, so I keep talking about community-based evaluation. So before I hand it over to my colleagues, I do want to situate the approach to evaluation that we're presenting on here, which is community-based evaluation. So for those of you who are not familiar, a community-based evaluation approach involves active participation of stakeholders in all phases of the evaluation. So right from determining what is the purpose of evaluation, why are we doing it, what kinds of evaluation questions need to be asked and answered, what kinds of methods should we use, what kinds of data should we collect that's meaningful in the context, what kind of analysis is appropriate, and then ultimately, how do we mobilize the findings so that there is some kind of useful change or action that results from the evaluation. So it's really important to think about the fact that stakeholders really drive the evaluation when we're talking about community-based in the process. The goal of the evaluation is to produce useful results so that there's some positive change. So we're not just collecting data for the sake of it. We want to do something with it. And of course, community-based evaluation is on a spectrum. So evaluation can be more or less community-based depending on the degree of participation of stakeholders. So there are 3 hallmarks of community-based evaluation. So that is that it's stakeholder-driven, so it's practically relevant to stakeholders. So people with lived refugee experience, settlement workers, sponsors, researchers, government, those are the stakeholders that we're working quite closely with. It's participatory, So that means that there's equitable control of the evaluation agenda. So it's not an evaluator determining what gets evaluated. It's kind of working in partnership to determine what and how things get evaluated and then shared and used. There's active engagement, and there's mutual benefit in the design and implementation of the evaluation. And it's also action-oriented. So the purpose of conducting the evaluation in the first place is for some kind of change. As I mentioned, we're not just collecting data for the sake of it, but we want to see some change. We want to use those findings to enhance practices, programs, and policies. So in a community-based evaluation approach, there are 4 phases. This is kind of similar, this image here, and you can get this information on our website. It's similar to the GPS for doing community-based evaluation. So the first phase is about really laying the foundation, and it's based on how we're going to engage stakeholders in the process. Phase 2 involves planning for the evaluation. The focus of this live event is on phase 3, which is data gathering and analysis. And then finally, phase 4 is about acting on the findings. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Jason, to take us through some of phase 3.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. So I've been doing evaluation for quite a few years now, and inevitably, in almost not every case, but in a lot of cases, I get calls to come in and help with an evaluation, and a lot of times the calls go something like this. You know, I need to develop a survey. I've got 5 staff, and I want to gather their experiences on something. So part of me, you know, one of the first questions I ask is like, why a survey? Why, you know, what is it about a survey? And sometimes the response is, well, my boss told me I had to do a survey. So sometimes decisions are made on data collection based on factors other than, you know, what's the best way to collect the data and what is the data we're looking for. So when we're talking about evaluation and doing evaluation within a community context, really what we want to focus on is the evaluation questions. Are people able to hear me? Good, okay. So the evaluation questions that we have really should be what's driving the evaluation or the methods that we choose. One of the other things I think that is really important to stop and think about when we're doing evaluation is, what are we already collecting? I'm always amazed at the amount of data that organizations collect. Lots of times they've been collecting data for years and years and years, and sometimes, unfortunately, that data just sits in a database or sits in some place, but nothing's done with it because they lack the capacity to do with it. So one of the first places I would always start, even before looking at whether or not we're going to do a survey or interviews or some other type of method, is just to do a quick look through what data already exists. And then sometimes it's simply modifying something that's already there, which is a lot more efficient in terms of resources. And then we can also look and see if there are still gaps. Then we can start to look at what types of methods we might want to consider when collecting new data. Pardon me. So one of the keys to looking at the methods for data collection, and I mentioned this before, is looking at the evaluation questions that we have. Lots of times people talk about, you know, qualitative versus quantitative dichotomies, and they talk about these really with value-laden terms, like, you know, qualitative is good and quantitative is bad, or quantitative is good and qualitative is bad. Really want to get away from the whole values. Methods are useful or they're not useful, and the usefulness or non-usefulness of these really is going to be dependent on the questions that I have. Quantitative tends to be really good for breadth of understanding. If I'm interested in measurement, if I want to look at generalizability, in other words, if I want to say, for example, this is what people in Ontario think about something, then that obviously is more of a quantitative question. If I'm interested in richness of data, if I want to understand why people think what they think, then that's going to lend itself more to a qualitative kind of an approach. And so on the screen, I've got listed a few different qualitative and quantitative approaches that are pretty standard. So some examples of qualitative approaches: individual interviews, focus groups, community forums, participant observation. You might be familiar with other ones maybe that you've seen in your location, things like photo voice, perhaps, or other arts-based kinds of approaches. All are examples of qualitative methods that really allow us to dive deeper into some of the questions that we might have. Some quantitative approaches, things like surveys, informal questionnaires, census data, large data sets that might have been gathered, intake forms. A lot of agencies use intake forms. So all of these, again, can provide information about a topic, the number of people accessing services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when we're collecting data within organizations, one of the things, again, I would caution against is sort of falling prey to this. It's got to be qualitative or it's got to be quantitative. Sometimes it can be both. And a lot of times when I'm doing evaluations, I try to combine both quantitative and qualitative methods to take advantage of some of the benefits of both of these approaches and methodologies. The other thing to consider in this, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the analysis plan, is that when we're considering what types of methods we want to use, we should also take into account who's going to be collecting this data and analyzing the data. And so, it's one thing if I'm hiring an external consultant who's going to manage all of my data collection, but if, I'm doing this off the side of my desk and the plan is for me to conduct, 1,000 interviews, do I actually have the time to do 1,000 interviews? Is that appropriate? And once I get that data, who's going to analyze that data? Like, that's going to take a long time to do that. And so when we're considering all of these methods as well, we have to take practicalities into consideration and think about what's going to get me the data I need to answer the questions I have in a way that's actually going to work for me. So having a plan is a really good thing. We want to make sure that we go into our data collection with some kind of approach. And so going back to the last comment, we need to understand, who's going to collect the data, what's the best approach for doing that, who's going to analyze the data. If I've got staff that I'm going to send out and collect the data, I want to make sure that they're adequately trained to be able to collect the data in an effective manner. But also, if we're working within a community context, I want to take into consideration the people that I'm going to be collecting data with. So if I'm working with vulnerable populations, perhaps I need to take that into account when assigning which staff would be going out and collecting data. Sometimes we want to think about what's going to be the most effective way. Are there going to be trust issues, power issues? Roxanne will talk a little bit about some of the ethical considerations when working in a community-based context. But these are all parts of the evaluation plan that we need to take into account when we're thinking about our data collection. We want to make sure that we have regular meetings so that when we go to data collection, our steering committee isn't surprised by the methods that we're coming up with. A lot of times our steering committee or our community groups that we're working with can be invaluable resources for us in setting up our evaluation plans. They may have insight in terms of what we need to think about when we're setting up our evaluation plans. They might have insight in terms of what would be the best way to collect the data, and so forth. And I've got lots of examples of situations that I went into thinking that I had a great evaluation plan that didn't end up working the way I thought. I'll just give you one example. I was doing some data collection within an Indigenous school, and I wanted to collect data from parents. And I thought I had a great plan set up. It worked well in lots of other schools. What I wanted to do was I set myself up in a classroom. I had coffee and pizza and cookies and all sorts of treats there. And in my brain, I thought this would be great because the parents are going to be there in the school. I've got lots of incentives for them to come and talk to me. And so I sat in my room by myself alone for about an hour with nobody coming to visit me. And I couldn't figure out why nobody wanted to come and have coffee and pizza and stuff. And finally, I had one of the teachers in the school come into the classroom and say, look, I've been asking parents if they wanted to come and talk to you, but they don't know you. And they are a little bit worried about coming in and talking to some person from the university who they don't know about these things. And so they would be willing if, the teacher, if me as the teacher, would sit in with them. And they wanted to know if that was okay. This is totally not the data analysis plan that I had. I was asking questions about the school, so I didn't really want the teachers in there. But I realized in that moment, having the teachers there was the only way that I was going to get data. So I had to change up my analysis plan, and it actually ended up being a great conversation. We had really good talks about the school and about the supports in the school. Now, had I thought of that before and actually had that conversation with the teachers before I set this whole thing up, that could have been a lot smoother, and I wouldn't have had sat in the room and wasted an hour sitting there, and I probably could have got a way better data. So cautionary tale, sometimes we can collect way better data if we include some of those stakeholders at an earlier or earlier point, in our plan. Sometimes we want to pilot test these things, try them out before we actually do the analysis. And then we really want to make sure that we are following our ethics. And again, I'm going to leave this section to Roxanne to talk more about some of the specific ethical issues about working within community context. So, pardon me. Well, we don't have lots of time this morning to do a deep dive into specific kinds of data analysis. Again, one of the things we really want to push home is, do you have the capacity to analyze the data? And so many times, and I mentioned this before, I've talked to organizations that have collected data for 20, 30 years that nobody's looked at. And not because they don't want to, and a lot of times it's simply a capacity issue. And so one of the things we really want to think about in setting up the analysis plan is, what is the capacity that the organization has to not only collect the data, but also analyze and understand the data. When I first started an evaluation, I was just out of graduate school, just finished my PhD, and I was so excited about doing all sorts of complex analysis. Made an analysis plan, and I had one colleague that came to me, and I was telling him about all these wonderful, exciting things that I was planning to do. And he was really good because he came to me and said, this is all really great. The problem is nobody's going to understand any of this stuff that you're doing. So it's really not going to be that useful to the organization. And what was interesting to me, and this is, I think, the transition from sort of graduate school where I was doing research for me to evaluation where I was doing evaluation for someone else, is that it wasn't all about me. And I had to really think about what was going to be the most useful for the agencies and the groups I was working with, and really pick the methods and the approaches that was going to provide them the data that they could use most effectively. So ways to analyze information. Again, I've got a bunch listed to perform content analysis. I could do statistical analysis. Again, I can include stakeholders in the process. That lots of times can help me understand what the data mean. I can look across different types of methodologies, again, including both quantitative and qualitative. I can look across stakeholders and look at what are the experience of different levels of stakeholders, right? The people with lived experience, perhaps, versus people who are running organizations. All could be important considerations that I take into account when doing my evaluations. And finally, what I really need to do when I'm thinking about this is just be open for the unexpected. I mean, again, I've shared a couple examples of situations where things didn't go as planned, but I could give you, 30 or 40 or 50 more where I went into a situation thinking it was going to go one way, and it completely went a different way. And so part of this is about collecting data, looking at what I've got, and then adjusting as necessary. There's no point in collecting bad data just for the sake of continuity. If it's garbage data today, it's still going to be garbage data tomorrow. And so, yes, sometimes we want to collect data, and have some continuity so we can make comparisons, but we really need to think about if the data I'm collecting is not meeting my needs, maybe the lesser of two evils is changing things up so that I can collect the data I want and starting fresh. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne to talk a little bit about ethics.
Thank you, Jason. Roxanne, I think you're going to be able to present now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm hoping. Okay, I see people typing. Yes, okay, good. Great to see you, and glad to be here with you today. I haven't forwarded a slide before, so hopefully I can do that. If not, Rebecca will have to help me out. But just talking about ethics, so just to give you some context, I mean, I have been doing community-based evaluation for about 15 years, but I also am an ED of a not-for-profit immigrant serving agency, so have a context of both working in the community, but also being a community-based evaluator. And what's interesting is, and I really love how my partners have described how when we're thinking about doing no harm, it's both at an individual level and a community level. And sometimes we're so focused on the individual level, which is very Western, right? Individual focused. And we have, we sometimes forget about the collective perspective, which does tend to be more apparent in like Indigenous perspectives on evaluation, et cetera. So, there you can see a couple of points around informed consent and ensuring we're protecting stakeholders and being aware of who's accessing data. I think just some things to highlight are that when we're thinking about informed consent, to really think about not just what do they perceive as harm, what will be harmful, but what they also perceive as harmful. So that can make a huge impact on participation or approaches. People often come from a background, especially if they're newcomers, where any kind of honest sharing of feedback can lead to serious consequences. So you have to be really explicit when you say there'll be no harm. You may have to say no matter if you say bad things, you'll still get services, right? So just being really explicit about that, and being honest about what it means at the ground level. And then in terms of being aware of who is getting access to the data, I think we just want to make sure that you're always clear how that data will be used. And to be honest, often thinking about not just the participants themselves, but the agencies you might be working with, your settlement partners, your newcomer organization serving partners. You really want to encourage their participation, as Jason was saying, not because it's a value, because it is a value, but also because it'll lead to better outcomes for your research. And I think asking your agency partners how you're going to use the information and sharing that can make a difference in the honest, the trust, and just reflecting back on the power dynamics, asking your partners who's going to speak here, who's not going to speak. Power dynamics are so, like, if you've ever seen The Power Flower, if you've ever done anti-oppression work, I mean, where and how power is shared, it can sometimes be in modes that we don't even can't even consider, right? You know, someone like myself who's born and raised in Edmonton, Alberta, I will totally speak my mind at a city council meeting, but if you put me in a room with my aunt, I will, you know, defer until maybe there's some respect, or until she's had her say first. So we just don't understand what those power dynamics might be, and you might need an insider or a community connector or cultural broker to help you get through that. So I'm going to try to forward the slide. Oh, I did it. The other thing that we talk about, and this slide addresses evaluation with people who've been made vulnerable. You know, you can see some of the things, and I'm sure some of this might be new. You might have to delve. Each of these probably could be a whole half hour, each of these bullet points, when you look at literacy rates and consent and fatigue and sharing stories. I think first, I know there's a mix of people here. Some of you might be community-based researchers. Some of you might be settlement agencies. I know of some organizations here in Edmonton. We've actually tried to take a step ahead of this. You know, absolutely, I think researchers have to take the initiative in this, but also as agencies, you can do this too. So for example, one of our agencies in Edmonton, the Islamic Family Social Services Agency, IFSA, they created their own kind of like guidelines if you want to do research with our population. And so therefore, instead of having to go through these issues every time, they kind of just have it in a statement so that the researchers and the evaluators they work with know how we're addressing it. So I think if you're from a settlement agency or from a serving agency, you can do this yourself. I know us at MFRS, we've actually also come up with our own sharing story guidelines. So even if we're sharing stories, you know, give us a success story about one of your clients, which comes up a lot in our funder reports, then we have a set of guidelines on how we share that story, how we get consent for that story, asking ourselves what kind of narrative does this contribute to? So, and then really understanding the role of your frontline service providers. They have such insight into all of this vulnerability. It's that the thing about this sector is that it's so complex and always changing, depending on what the policies are. And especially since a couple of years ago, where now the federal government can make policy changes like on the dime, it's hard to keep up. So what I would say is get their feedback, find out if they're cautious, why they're cautious. They'll have great insight that they can offer you. Being trauma informed and creating safety. I think what I just really want to highlight here, and there's excellent bullet points here and a good reference for you to look at. And again, like this could be a whole hour presentation. I think what's really important to remember is that there's more at stake here than the research. Frontline service providers will always put their relationship ahead of anything else, because without a relationship, there's no service provision. There's no accessibility for clients who have previously don't have access to other kinds of services. So that is prime in newcomer settlement agencies' heads. And so I think what you have to remember is these concepts of trauma-informed, it runs very deep. There's a really good article. It's the ADAPT model. I'm happy to share it with you if people are interested. But the ADAPT model talks about vulnerability being things like justice, safety. Those kinds of things create the foundation for everything that a newcomer or refugee or traumatized family does in the community. And so if someone's really pushing for something like a community member or a frontline service provider is pushing for something in your research, really listen carefully, because they're picking up on something that we may not understand. And I have to say, like, I'll just be honest, like often if I get a research, and so, you know, there's some researchers probably here who I have contact with, but if I get a research and saying, hey, can you recruit things for me? I will look through their methods and their approach. And sometimes I won't even take the time to email that person and say this approach doesn't work, because there's so many honestly, like newcomer settlement agencies, they get a request for research like once, twice a week, right? So do the work for them. And if you can look at this early on, then there's even a more chance that they'll even participate. Otherwise, sometimes we don't do that. I know we're talking about evaluation, but even evaluation, sometimes we'll do that. And then, so finally, the last piece that I want to highlight is, and then just kind of this slide talks to specifically when you're talking about evaluation in reinforcing a story. And for refugees, that story might be the self-rescue story. And I think what I want to do is bring this up to a different level and just say, the stories you're telling with your evaluation results, what narrative do they contribute to? You have to be very careful in terms of ensuring, like there's objective findings and there's truth, but you also have to realize that that truth is within a social construct and understanding of who refugees are and who newcomers are and who racialized people are. And so at our organization, we are very conscious of what narrative are we creating with these results? And if we are creating a narrative and it's still honest and truth, how can we balance that narrative with the complexity and the context that helps create an understanding of that narrative rather than simplifying what we often see in terms of stories of newcomers, stories of racialized individuals, so that you're not contributing to stereotypes and generalizations. So just being aware of those things. So those are my slides, and I think Rebecca takes over from here.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. And I would also like to thank Rebecca and Jason and all of you for engaging the presentation. Just to let the audience know that a recorded version of these live events will be available and shared on our website at evalforrefugee.ca. So now it's the time for our question and answer period. I'm going to read your questions and we will try to answer as many of them as possible in the remaining time.
Sure. And Sherry, maybe just if anybody has a very specific, we're having some presenter issues, but if you have a very specific question for Jason, I'm sure Roxanne and I can try to field that. But if you do have a question specifically for Jason, we can swap presenters and he can respond as well.
For sure. Thank you, Rebecca. So we have the first question here from Ishni. Her question is, for the analysis of visual data, for example, photo, voice, or reflective drawings, what analysis method will be suitable?
Great. I can start by answering that, and I would, Roxanne, feel free to jump in. I think it depends on what additional data you're collecting alongside that ArtSpace method. So if you're doing photo voice, or your photo voice, for those of you that aren't familiar with photo voice, is when you have kind of a guiding evaluation or research question. What is your experience with settlement services with this organization? That could be the kind of question that gets asked. And you would give individuals cameras and or they just use their phones and they take images to reflect their experiences rather than sitting and having an interview sharing their experiences. And some people really like to, it's a different way of getting at experience. And then you can have kind of like a group conversation, a focus group, an interview about the images that they took. So that's where we're collecting an additional source of qualitative information. So that interview or focus group data, there I would use content analysis. If I was looking at that narrative piece of the conversation we had about the images that were taken. So, and again, Roxanne, feel free to jump in. When you're looking at things like reflective drawings or some kind of, again, you can have people describe to you, like explain, walk me through what you've created here. Roxanne, actually, I think we were on that project together maybe, and it was several years ago where we actually had first and second generation immigrant youth walk us through a journey, and they physically walked us through a journey, and they actually kind of mapped it on big butcher block paper, and then we had them first just draw that sketch, use images on this big butcher block paper, and then describe for us your journey. And in that description was that kind of rich data, but we ended up having to do content analysis on that narrative. I have a colleague, her name is Michelle Cyril, and she's based out of Queen's University, and she does a lot of arts-based research. And on her website, which I can, it's a Wix website, but if you look up Michelle Cyril, Searle, she's actually got a lovely website, and she's got a whole kind of section on strategies and tips for analysis specifically around art space. So I'd encourage you to poke around in there. Another space you might want to poke around in is better evaluation. So they're a group out of Australia, and they've got tons of resources and really practical. They typically have kind of like a blog post, maybe it's a resource, or even like a YouTube video that would kind of be a how-to. So I hope that answers the question. I know that was a lengthy answer. And Roxanne, I'll invite you if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I think that's good. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we have our next question from Imen. Do you need a consultant to analyze your data, or is it okay to rely on your acquired statistical knowledge for this purpose?
Okay, great question. So I'm assuming you're kind of talking from an insider perspective. You're an insider within the organization. You've gathered a bunch of quantitative, maybe it's from questionnaires or survey-related information. I would say if you've got the capacity in-house to do that, I mean, many people, and when I'm working alongside people, I know Jason is the same, we kind of look at what analysis kind of capacity do you have, and then what kinds of software do you have access to? So most people have access to Excel through Microsoft Office, and you can do simple frequencies, how many people responded to this kind of question in this way, so you can get some descriptive kind of information. If you've got statistical knowledge, I would encourage you to use it. If it's getting a little more advanced, so that's always the thing where, people will come to us and say, I want to prove that my program is, resulting in healthy child outcomes. And you'll say, okay, hang on, let's have a conversation about that. First of all, what information are you collecting? And can you even make those kind of claims or statements, right? And sometimes that does require fairly complex statistical analyses, like a regression analysis or some kind of factor analysis. And if you don't have the capacity to do that in-house, you could reach out to somebody else that might. And there's lots of opportunities to connect with organizations like the Evaluation Capacity Network that we're part of. Rich and Joanna, who are both on the call today, they're with the Center for Community-Based Research, and they do a fair amount of work to support organizations there. We also do some connecting between students that might have that kind of capacity around statistical analysis or doing their, graduate programs in that area. And they're looking for opportunities to connect with community and actually do some more meaningful kind of data analysis and interpretation alongside community organizations. But I think the number one is, yes, you can do it if you've got the capacity to do it. If you need support, there's lots of ways to connect out. And again, I would encourage you to go check out our website, Eval for Refugee, because we have a number of mentors and coaches from across Canada that have expertise in this. So if you're looking for some support, I would encourage you to go check that out.
I just want to add to that, Rebecca, that in addition to the two websites that you described, the Eval for Refugees and the Evaluation Capacity Network, I have found students to be just such an excellent resource for as a settlement agency or as a newcomer serving agency. Often, you would love to take the time to analyze your data and to check that back with your staff and to seek meaning in that. But you often the multitasking kind of takes away your breath and your brain power. So I would really recommend a student, especially a graduate student. They need programs, and it doesn't have to be I find all of the social service and health promotion, public health, social work, applied social work. I find getting a graduate student, they just have the focus for you to fulfill that function. And it may seem like a long time, just a little tip that I do is I have a document, which is all of my student projects that I would love to have done if I had time to do. And so whenever, because you never know when you're going to get a call and say, hey, I have a student who's available 8 hours a week for 8 months. Do you need them? And you're like, do I need them? Do I need them? And it's just, if you have a document ready with all of your student projects, then you kind of have it ready, kind of like, okay, yeah, this is exactly what I would like done. So that's just a tip from a practitioner perspective.
Yeah, that's great, Roxanne. And most universities across Canada have some kind of community service learning arm to what they do. And so again, that is a nice portal into university. Sometimes it feels overwhelming. Who do I contact? You can go to the Center for Community-Based Research. They're based out of Waterloo, but there are typically portals into universities. Sometimes it's through an individual or through something like a community service learning arm. And they'll usually try to match you up with students that need practicum, volunteer opportunities, and have expertise. And students are, like you said, Roxanne, they are looking to get into community. They want applied experiences. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Roxanne and Rebecca. So we have another question that's qualitative. When conducting qualitative research or attempting to, where and how can you validate your methodology?
Okay, that's an interesting question. And I'm not sure if the question is about validating the methodology or more about validating the data that you gather, because there are very specific ways of, and in qualitative research, you call it slightly different things. Validation and reliability are kind of more quantitatively oriented terms. Things like transferability, credibility, those are more qualitative terms. So when we gather a bunch of data, one way of doing that is something called member checking. So if I do an interview with somebody and I record that, whether I type that out or I audio record it and then transcribe it, I can share that back with my participant. And I can say, did I capture what you said accurately? And they can, or do you have anything more to add? So that's kind of one way of doing that. Member checking can go another level where you can actually do some preliminary analysis and you can share that back with, whether it's a group, you did a focus group, had a group conversation, or individually, to say, here's how I'm interpreting this information that you shared with me. Am I right? Right? Because we all come at interpretation with certain lenses and biases, because I've got certain experiences that I'm going to attach to the narrative that I'm reading. And so you want to make sure that you're getting it right. And that is a process of validation and qualitative research. Another piece is something called an audit trail. So an audit trail is essentially that where you're creating a trail that you can follow based on all of the decisions you've made in your analysis process. So as you're analyzing data, as you start to pull together big pieces of information or narratives that people are saying into codes or categories or themes, you need to sort of produce a narrative alongside that, or the audit trail, to say, these are the decisions I made. Here's why I'm calling this particular group of kind of sentences or quotes that people are saying trust. That's why I'm calling that trust as an overall umbrella. So those are kind of three different techniques. And Roxanne, I don't know if you want to add anything into that.
I think, and again, like you said, Rebecca, I wasn't sure there's so many levels to that question, but I did just want to say that sometimes what I see happening in programs is somebody says, well, let's just use qualitative data that we get from this group. And I'll be like, well, and the way I like to say it is you have to describe what you're doing in such a way that somebody else could come and do the exact same thing. Like when you have to be really transparent about your methods, because so, for example, there was one program we knew of, and it was just difficult to get some of their frontline workers together. They all kind of worked in different parts of the city, and they're like, well, can we just gather insights from them? And I'm like, you can, but you have to list the questions that you're asking. You have to make sure you ask the same questions. You have to explain why the group comes together. You have to explain how often you collect that data in such a way so that if somebody wanted to do that same study again, they knew exactly how you did it. So this is more about, checking your methods. Like, if you're trying to say, well, are my methods for collecting this qualitative data this correct? That's how I would describe it at a very ground level, just so that it doesn't appear and it doesn't appear to the outside person that you're just randomly collecting the quotes that make you sound great, right? You want to show the systematic part of it, why you did it and the decisions you made. So I don't know what the academic term for that is, but that's what I do.
Rigor.
Rigor.
It's an interesting question though too, because I think often, and I just had a conversation yesterday with somebody, especially I find we butt up against this when we're dealing with funders, where though that qualitative narrative is lovely, those stories are nice, but show us the numbers, right? So it's kind of getting into that debate about, is one method more valid than another, right? And ultimately, validity is about the inferences that I generate from the data. Are they valid? Are they accurate? Do they make sense? And can I do something with them? And I know that's a big rub for people because, we want to see the numbers, right? We want to see, but I think that's sort of, a context that people sit in where numbers are better or more valid, right? And it's sort of, how do you balance those two things out? Because numbers only tell part of the story, right? And the words tell the other part, and vice versa. And we didn't get into much of this. I think Jason just touched on it, but that's where we start to look at how do we use multiple methods and perhaps mix those methods. So integrate both the qualitative and quantitative information to have a more robust, deep, rich kind of understanding of the program or the question that you're trying to address.
Great. So we have another interesting question.
Ooh.
And that's COVID-19 has necessitated using virtual environments to create an online community for participatory research. How do we build relationships and trust in these communities?
That is a big question. Oh boy, I don't know. Roxanne, do you want to take that? I don't know if you guys have shifted. I'm doing lots of virtual work.
Yeah.
Primarily the work that I've been doing, we already had relationships, right? So it was a little bit easier to shift online, but actually I see one of my students is on the call. Jason and I just wrapped up teaching for the week, and it was a 1 week intensive, and it was even that where we had to figure out how do you build relationships really rapidly in this online space. And we ended up doing a fair bit of kind of introductions. I saw a piece today, an instructor does a video of themselves, not just, hi, my name's Rebecca Goker, here's my area of expertise, and here's a funny fact about me, but actually did a bit of a video of themselves introducing, and it was a bit vulnerable, but sort of to say, here's who I am, here are my likes and dislikes, here's the environment that I now work in, right? So it's kind of, building some of that relational piece that you can't get when you're not sitting right beside somebody or engaging in sort of a space, right? Like there is some of that that's missing. We used breakout rooms in Zoom and kind of had different activities within those breakout, because it is hard too when you've got, it's easy when you've only got 3 to 5 people that you're dealing with in a space, you can still have a reasonable conversation. Once that room gets a little bigger in a virtual space, but how do you sort of break off and do some activities together and create smaller spaces that you come back into that larger group, right? And again, really thinking about how do people like to share, whether they're virtual or in a face-to-face environment, people like to build relationships in lots of different ways. And I don't know, Roxanne, do you have, or Sherry, maybe you've got some ideas. It's a big question we're all grappling with right now.
It's a big question. It's interesting because we had a community-based research project, and we were supposed to launch into our learning lab phase, where we were supposed to have people give feedback on some of our findings and then take them one step further to generate solutions. And same thing. And the only thing I would add to what Rebecca said, like absolutely small groups, maybe is like if you think of like how long it takes to develop relationships in person and then kind of stretch it even further, like you might need 2 meetings instead of 1. maybe the first meeting is about that building relationship, and then the second meeting, which is hard, right? Because the other thing is people are stressed at this time, and you're looking at community members who also have kids at home and who are supporting their kids. So, like we've done things where we've created different time slots so people can come in at one of 3 times. So instead of having one big group, we'll offer 3 small groups. We've also done a thing where we've had some of our facilitators call them first and do some one-on-one conversations first, so that when they come into the virtual space, they feel like they know at least one other person there. So it's just taken a lot more time, and unfortunately, I think it's the way of the future. The other thing we're looking at is doing things in person, but very small groups, is like 6 to 8 people in a really big room, because you know how it is online. You can't interrupt people. You can't talk over. It's as my family Zoom chats have illustrated. So yeah, those are really good questions. I will say that I'm part of this community of practice. So one of my guru books that I follow for participatory facilitation is Sam Kainer's Community at Work. It's a manual, and they just released all of these tools for facilitating online, and I can give you access to that resource, because I've started using things like Mural and Miro. Should I type those in? They're kind of like all of these whiteboards with stickies, and I found those are helpful, like, because some people aren't verbal. They need to see it up. They need to see stickies on a wall, and I did a mood board once, right? Like I was like, oh, how are you feeling? Go get an image from the internet and pop it on, and then it got out of control, and people were putting GIFs, and I didn't know how to stop them. But yeah.
Thank you, Roxanne. I'm writing that down.
Amazing. Thanks for all of you who asked these questions, and thanks to Roxanne and Rebecca for answering the questions. So we are almost to the end of the live event. We have a couple of more minutes, but the good news is this conversation and discussion is not over. So we have a great platform that you all can join, and I'm gonna tell you in a second where it is. So we have a community of practice and a group called Equipping for Community-Based Evaluation. You can go to settlenet.org in order to join this group and continue this discussion over there. And there are people who are interested in evaluation, and you can get answers to your questions and have this conversation over there. And also don't forget to check our website, evalforrefugee.ca, in order to get posted about our upcoming live events. And if you want to know more about the 4 phases of community-based evaluation, again, check our website. We have a series of 5 webinars that we recorded, and data collection and analysis is also one phase. We have a full webinar on that. So if in case you're interested to know more about that phase or any other phases. And we also offer customized support, mentors, coaching, and training across Canada. So if you're willing to get those supports, please check out our website. And here I would like to thank our wonderful presenters, Rebecca, Jason, and Roxanne, for engaging the conversation and the presentation. And I would like to ask the audience to take 2 minutes after this live event to share your feedback. After you log out of this webinar, the feedback form will automatically show up. So just let us know what other topics you might like to explore in the future live events, and we will try to continue providing you relevant and quality support for your evaluation. Thanks, Rebecca, Jason, and Roxanne.
Thank you, everyone. Nice meeting you virtually.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.